Hello and welcome to Thursday in Parliament. Coming up, it's an emotional afternoon in the Commons as female MPs speak of their experience of rape and sexual violence.
I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell the police.
Peers debate what Brexit will mean for our defence, and there are calls for a complete ban on the trade in ivory in an attempt to save the world's elephants.
It is estimated that some 30%, perhaps 144,000, have disappeared in the past 7 years.
But first, an MP has moved colleagues to tears after revealing she was raped at 14. Michelle Thompson shared her personal story during a Commons debate focused on the UN International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women.
Today I am going to relay an event that happened to me many years ago, and I wanted to give a very personal perspective to help people in this place and outside understand one element of sexual violence against women. When I was 14, I was raped. As is common, it was by somebody who was known to me. He had offered to walk me home from a youth event, and in those days everybody walked everywhere. It was quite common to do that. It was early evening, it wasn't dark, I was wearing, I'm guessing, jeans and a sweatshirt. I knew my way around where I lived, I was very comfortable, and we did go a slightly different way, but I didn't think anything of it. He asked me, he told me he wanted to show me something in a wooded area, and at that point, I must admit, I was alarmed. I did have a warning bell. But I overrode that warning bell because I knew him, and therefore there was a level of trust in place. And to be honest, looking back at that point, I don't think I knew what rape was. It was not something that was talked about. My mother never talked to me about it. I didn't hear other girls or other women talking about it. It was mercifully quick, and I remember, first of all, feeling surprise, then fear, then horror, as I realised I quite simply couldn't escape. Because obviously he was stronger than me. And there was no sense, even initially, of any sexual desire from him, which I suppose looking back again I find odd. My senses were absolutely numbed, and thinking about it now, 37 years later, I cannot remember hearing anything when I replay it in my mind. Afterwards, I walked home alone. I was crying, I was cold, and I was shivering, and I now realise, of course, that was the shock response. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell the police. I bottled it all up inside me. I hoped briefly and appallingly that I might be pregnant so that would force a situation to help me control it. And of course, without support, the capacity and resources I had within me to process it were very limited. I was very ashamed. I was ashamed that I had allowed this to happen to me. And I had a whole range of internal conversations about, I should have known. Why did I go that way? Why did I walk home with him? Why didn't I understand the danger? I deserved it because I was too this, I was too that. I felt that I was spoiled and impure. And I really felt revulsion towards myself. A rape happens when a man makes a decision to hurt someone he feels he can control. Rapes happen because of the rapist, not because of the victim. And we women and our society have to stand up for each other. We have to be courageous. We have to call things out and say where things are wrong. We have to support and nurture our sisters as we do with our sons. Like many women of my age, I have on occasion encountered other aggressive actions towards me, both in business and, in fact, in politics. But one thing I realise now is that I'm not scared, and he was. I'm not scared, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor.
I thank the Honourable Lady for what she has said and the way in which she said it, which has left an indelible impression upon us all. Mims Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an unbelievable thing to follow on from the member for Edinburgh West after she's shared a horrific event from 37 years ago. But as a mother of two daughters, understanding the impact of being a 14-year-old affected by that incident is and the explanation of the sense of blame and shame is very hard to comprehend.
I was 20 and the worst thing that I could ever imagine happening to me was about to take place. I was going to be one of those very rare statistics of a woman who is attacked by a stranger, not by someone she knows. I was in my second year at university. The man had seen me walk past his car and had waited ahead for me to turn the corner. As I came up against him, all those words of advice your mum gives you, knee him where it hurts, then run like hell, well, they disappeared. I was frozen in fear. As he shoved me to the ground, trying to rape me, I fought back, but I was battered. It was only the community-spirited Indian neighbour further down the road that saved me from something much worse. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, I count myself as one of the lucky ones. I'd managed to memorise his car number plate, and he was caught an hour later. He went to court, not many do. He pleaded guilty. I didn't have to go through the horrors of a trial. He was sentenced. I didn't have to look over my shoulder, checking if he was following me. He was a stranger. I didn't have to wake up in the same bed as him, go to work with him as my boss. He didn't use a broken bottle to hurt me. He was alone and not with a group of other men. It was only once and not several times. The point to this story is that even though on the scale of violence against women, I was lucky because justice was done, the following few years were hard. I got afraid walking alone, so I bought a bike. I got scared in the night. I slept with a knife. I was easily startled and cried at the drop of a hat. But Madam Deputy Speaker, again, I was lucky. I didn't have a job to keep down, children to care for, elderly relatives to see to. I could work my way through the impact of this violent assault at my own speed and in my own space.
The debate had been opened by a Labour MP.
Worldwide, an estimated 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence. That is a staggering statistic. The World Health Organization highlights that as well as being a human rights issue, violence against women is a major public health issue, with women who have experienced violence more likely to have babies with low birth weights and experience depression. Each year in the UK, up to 3 million women experience violence, and on average, 1 woman dies in Britain at the hands of a man every 3 days.
The chair of the Women and Equalities Committee called for compulsory sex and relationship education in schools.
We mustn't continue just to tackle the symptoms of this problem of violence against women. We also have to tackle the root causes as well. The sort of behaviour that some of us had to experience, perhaps in the workplace 30 years ago, is now something we would not tolerate. Yet we are insisting that young people keep quiet, don't speak out, and don't get the support that they need when they experience that sort of behaviour at schools.
I want to start by paying my heartfelt thanks to the member from Edinburgh West. You know, to hear her talking about her rape when she was 14 years old and breaking that taboo by talking about it in this place was truly remarkable.
She said the government had launched a new strategy in March and provided £80 million in funding alongside strengthening the law. And she turned to education.
We must do more to educate children about healthy relationships, including sexual relationships. Indeed, that no must mean no in every circumstances. There is a huge amount of determination on ongoing work to deliver this. Now, she's absolutely right to say we all need to talk about it, and as a mother of 3 children I can say it can be a bit embarrassing, not least for my children, to have to sit down and talk about this. I think my son has just about recovered from having to talk to his mum about online porn.
But she made no promises on compulsory sex and relationship education in schools in England. Now, on Wednesday night, a clear majority of MPs backed the government's timetable for beginning the UK's exit from the EU. A motion tabled by Labour but amended by the government explicitly stated that Article 50, initiating Brexit, would be invoked by the end of March. It was supported by 461 MPs, 75 voted against. When the Commons gathered on Thursday, there were very different interpretations of what had happened. The shadow leader of the Commons thought it was the Prime Minister who'd shifted position by accepting elements of Labour's original motion, demanding the government publish a plan for its negotiations before Article 50 was triggered.
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the government finally accepted they needed a plan, a strategy, a framework. The Leader of the House may have said that the opposition were quarrelling, like mutiny on the Bounty as reshot by the Carry On team, a genre I'm sure the British Film Institute are rapidly thinking, where does this fall? But can I remind the Leader of the House that it was 40 government MPs who were going to vote on the opposition motion, which then resulted the Prime Minister from Bahrain to concede to the Labour motion.
I think what was very striking about the vote last night was that for the first time the opposition front bench and most, but not all, of Labour members of Parliament accepted the Prime Minister's timetable to trigger Article 50 by the end of March 2017. And given that the Shadow Foreign Secretary had said as recently as September that we ought to go back to the people before taking a final decision to leave the EU, that suggests a possibly welcome change of heart on the part of the opposition, and I hope that it is genuine and sustained.
David Liddington. It's a tragedy that when problems are global, politics has gone local. That's the view of Lord Robertson, who was once Secretary-General of NATO. He was speaking in a debate about the impact of Brexit on the UK's defences. Several peers said that with the UK outside the EU, it should raise its game in NATO and forge alliances with France and Germany. The government insisted it was not turning its back on the world.
The post-war settlement is unravelling. The referendum result, the disobliging comments about NATO from President-elect Trump, and the rise of the far-right populism in Europe all make that abundantly clear. If NATO and the EU are now in danger of crumbling away, we do need an urgent rethink of our domestic policies and priorities.
Lord Robertson said leaving the EU would have a huge impact on the UK's defence forces.
It will certainly affect our armed forces and diplomatic service, and not for the better. It will damage, our leaving will damage the UK and its reputation and influence. Our leaving will damage the EU and its partnership with NATO, tackling the myriad of problems and challenges and perils which will face us in the world today. And by opting out as a key player in the EU side of that partnership that was reforged this week, it will weaken NATO at a time when the alliance has never been historically more needed. I think it's a tragedy at the moment that just as the problems that we face of migration, of terrorism, of a resurgent Russia, of pandemics, proliferation, and much, much more, the issues have gone global and the politics have gone local and far too parochial for the safety of our people.
My Lords, one thing seemed to me is crystal clear. Having taken the decision to Brexit, Britain is now much, much, much more alone, and our defence choices are far, far starker than they were in the hours before President Trump was elected 1 month and 1 week ago. Before, during the Brexit debate, we argued we didn't need the European Union because we had NATO. But we now have an isolationist American president who's made it perfectly clear in his speeches that he doesn't much believe in NATO and doesn't even mind it being unstitched. Now, I have a suspicion that what will happen in the next few weeks is that words will be dragged out of President Trump's mouth that says he didn't really mean that and he does believe in NATO. But, my Lords, NATO and alliances do not depend as much on words as they do on will. And no one can doubt that the will of an isolationist American president who admires President Putin is not going to be the same as the will we've experienced before from our partners across the Atlantic by any measure.
There is one thing that will not change, and that is the relationship between our security in these islands and the security of the rest of Europe. We cannot change our geography by referendum. The safety of Europe is our safety. We long ago gave up the idea of national defence in favour of collective security, and nothing that has happened over the past months has changed that. We may be looking to renationalise aspects of our economic and legal structures, but renationalising our defence is simply not practicable.
The government has made it clear that as we leave the EU, we will not be turning our back on the world. The UK remains a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the second largest contributor to NATO, and a leading member of the G7, the G20, and the Commonwealth. We take these responsibilities seriously, and we will continue to be a strong and influential European voice on the world stage, promoting and defending global peace and security, and promoting our trade interests.
And he said the UK had strong relations with other EU countries.
Our defence relationship with France is growing all the time and is building on the Lancaster House Agreement that underpins it. Germany is now a Tier 1 country with the United States and France in the SDSR 2015, and we have growing relationships with many other countries.
You're watching Thursday in Parliament with me, Alicia McCarthy. On Wednesday, a man was found guilty of the racially aggravated harassment of the Labour MP Luciana Berger after posting a series of anti-Semitic rants. Joshua Bonehill-Payne wrote 5 hate-filled blogs harassing the Liverpool Wavertree MP. Speaking after the verdict, Ms Berger insisted racist abuse and harassment over the internet is a horrific crime. In the Commons, MPs wanted to know what the government was doing to tackle all sorts of hate crime.
Like many others in this chamber, I was very concerned about the spike in the number of racial and religious aggravated offences after the referendum. Can my honourable and learned friend please tell the House whether that trend has continued in recent months?
To David Rutt.
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise this issue because I think we were all concerned with the spike that clearly occurred after the referendum. The total number of racial and religiously aggravated offences being reported in July of this year was 41% higher than the previous year. But I'm happy to report, Mr Speaker, that the number of that type of reported offence has now declined and are at similar levels to before the referendum.
Sir David Amis.
Would my honourable friend look very carefully at the law relating to abusive and offensive online posts? Often when I look at these remarks, particularly when someone has died, it is quite incredible that newspapers seem to host these posts when I think these cowards should have their names and addresses printed along with the offensive posts.
My honourable friend raises a proper point of increasing concern. Can I assure him that anonymity, perceived or real, is not an escape route for perpetrators? The use of false online profiles and websites still mean, Mr Speaker, they are traceable, and these people can and will be pursued, just like the appalling individual who only this week was convicted of offences arising from a racist campaign against the honourable member, the honourable member for Liverpool Wavertree.
On the ground in North Wales, the number of prosecutions generally is falling. And for that reason, how can we ensure that public perceptions are reflected in prosecuting policy so that more individuals who commit crime get taken to court and dealt with by magistrates who tell me that their courts are empty?
Mr General.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I'm obviously following the position very carefully in all parts of England and Wales. And he's right to say that there are some areas like his where there hasn't been the rise that we've seen in others. I think what we have to do is further encourage consistency. The training that's been rolled out in recent months to all the CPS areas, I think, needs to bed in. And I think with that approach, we will see a rise across the board in not just the prosecution of these offences, but the confidence of victims to come forward.
And Jim Shannon.
Would the Attorney-General agree that prosecution of hate crimes is helped when the victim feels supported enough to give evidence, and that more training must be provided by the teams that deal with hate crime UK-wide to ensure that all possible support is afforded to victims and their families?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman knows from his experience in Northern Ireland that the Leonard Cheshire Disability Organisation have an excellent scheme in place to support victims, and it really echoes the point that I was making earlier about the need for such best practice to be spread to give better support.
Now let's go back to the Lords, where a peer raised a report that showed more than 300 police officers have been accused of using their position to sexually exploit people, including victims of crime. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary said abuse of authority for sexual gain was now the most serious form of corruption facing police in England and Wales. In the Lords, a peer raised this and the latest figures from Women's Aid on violence against women.
76% of women killed by their ex-partner or ex-spouse were killed in the first year of separation. But today we hear, on top of this, that hundreds of police officers have abused their position of trust to sexually exploit vulnerable people. Could the Noble Lady the Minister say what the government is doing to protect and help women at dangerous and vulnerable times, and particularly those who manage to leave abusive relationships to start a new life?
The figures that are released today are absolutely stark, and we welcome the work that Women's Aid has done on the femicide census, and committed to working in partnership with them to help to improve the response to domestic homicides.
She turned to the revelations about the police.
It's important to remember that HMIC findings relate to a very small number of police officers of staff, and the vast majority of over 200,000 police personnel are dedicated and passionate about protecting the public. The College of Policing will be releasing updated guidance on police and media relationships in the new year, but also the College of Policing has been asked to consider further the feasibility of developing a new supplementary addendum on the Code of Ethics, but that is to take nothing away from the shocking findings of today.
A Conservative MP has called for emergency action to save the African elephant. Currently, tens of thousands of elephants are killed by poachers every single year to steal and sell their tusks. While there's an international ban on buying and selling ivory to other countries, it's still possible to buy and sell certain kinds of ivory within countries. The UK government recently announced that it's to spend an extra £13 million on new ways to tackle the illegal wildlife trade. Jeremy Lefroy said that the elephant population in sub-Saharan Africa had declined dramatically over the past decade.
It is estimated that some 30%, perhaps 144,000, have disappeared in the past 7 years, substantially as a result of poaching. Estimates of the remaining population vary, but perhaps there are as few as 400 to 450,000. This is an emergency, and it requires emergency action.
But the president of the British Antique Dealers Association spoke out against a total ban.
The purchaser of a carved ivory medieval Christian diptych is not the same buyer because it's there wanting the ivory because it's a beautifully worked piece which is culturally and historically significant, that happens to be made of ivory. It is not the same as modern day trinkets. To ban the sale of 18th century cabinet inlaid with the small pieces of ivory, or an 18th century portrait miniature painted on a thin slither of ivory, in order to stop Far Eastern buyers from purchasing contemporary carved Buddhas or trinkets, makes no sense.
I did find the member for Kensington's remarks quite objectionable. The fact calling it a beautiful worked piece. It was a beautiful elephant once. Calling it artworks. What is artistic about murder? And therefore, what I'd say is, whilst these pieces may be in existence, they should no longer be traded, and therefore we would bring a total ban from these benches across all ivory.
The minister said a poacher could earn more in one night than in 5 years in other jobs.
We do need to raise awareness to Asian consumers to the devastating impact they are having in elephant populations.
And we need to inform, engage with, and ultimately change behaviour. And I think we saw leadership, as was referred to by His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge when he visited Hanoi recently, alongside my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. And that kind of engagement, I think, is a key part of what UK leadership can do. To achieve this, we need to change the dynamics of the market. We need to reduce not just the availability, but also the acceptability of trade in ivory. And that is why in the UK we are looking at our own market. Other countries, such as the US, have taken action, and we want to see concerted international action. And most importantly, we want to see action from China to follow through on the commitments they have made to close their market.
Therese Coffey. And that's it from me for now. But do join me on Friday night at 11 for a roundup of the week here at Westminster, when, among other things, we'll be talking to Lord Cormac about the size of the House of Lords and hearing from two of Parliament's newest MPs about what it's like to join the Commons. But from now, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.